my argument today is that we are really at a crossroads. And my argument tomorrow is that we can direct the allocation of resources over the coming 30 years to build the kind of future that we should want. Should, in the sense that it is the one indicated by good ethics, the one that will lead to eudaimonia, to well-being of the human population. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to make the argument today about why we are at a crossroads. And the title of these lectures is The World in 2050, because I believe that we need to choose today the investments and the strategies that are going to determine the world in 2050. Because most of the investments we need to make, whether it's investments in our children's education, or whether it's investments in our energy systems, and our physical infrastructure, are long-lasting investments and determine the course of our local, national, and global economy over a period of roughly 30 years. I don't speak about the world in 2100 because it's something to think about, but too hard to direct. Whereas the world in 2050 is actually a practical time horizon. It's much longer than our governments think about. When we have President Trump, the time duration of thinking is to the next tweet. It isn't even a 24-hour news cycle. More normally, when we have mentally stable presidents, maybe they think in terms of the next election. But we need to think in a 30-year time horizon, because that is the real nature of the investment horizon that we face, whether it's for investments in people, especially our children, or investments in infrastructure, or investments in the maturation of new technologies, which have their own gestation periods and which also have time horizons of a generation. So I believe that there are two futures possible that we should pay attention to. A true, accurate, possible dystopia. In other words, a world falling apart. I don't think that that is an illusion. I think it is a real possibility. But there's also the possibility of sustainable development. Sustainable development means prosperity, social justice, and environmental sustainability. It sounds utopian, but I don't want to use the word utopian because I don't mean a place that doesn't exist. I want to talk about the sustainable development possibility because I think it is as realistic and obviously desirable compared with the dystopian view. If you ask me, well, which of these is what's going to happen? The point of my lectures is, of course, that depends on human volition, and that depends on collective choice. Collective choice at the global level, but also as manifested by collective decision-making at different levels of collectivity, whether it's the UN system or whether it is our regional organizations like the European Union, or whether it is our nation states, or whether it is the city of Rome. We have collective choices to make to achieve sustainable development and to avoid the dystopian threat. What is the dystopian threat? The dystopian threat, in my opinion, has at least 4 elements to it. First is that some parts of the world would not escape from extreme deprivation. And one possible dystopia is that Africa, which I will show you in just a moment, will have a significant population in the future, could be overwhelmed and not break out of extreme deprivation, indeed fall into a downward spiral rather than an escape from poverty. So that's one kind of part of dystopia. A second is soaring inequality, even in our own countries, in Italy or in the United States. This pandemic has been a pandemic of inequality. This has been a pretty good year economically for professionals. They have savings in stock market that has gone up. Most of us work online rather routinely. We've been able to remain mostly safe, of course, with the tragic counter examples, but compared to poor workers who are working in the shops, in the streets, in the informal economy, that don't have savings invested in the stock market, that don't teach their courses online. It's a completely different world. And in general, this inequality has been widening for decades, mainly widening according to educational attainment. In the United States, but I think it's true in Italy and in Europe more generally, those with a university degree, by and large, are doing well, with exceptions, but those with less than a university degree, by and large, are struggling with housing, struggling with subsistence in some cases, struggling with health conditions that are worse, and so on. Now, a third part of the dystopian threat is environmental calamity. And we have at least 4 dimensions of environmental collapse underway. The first, of course, is runaway human-induced climate change. Human activity has already warmed the planet by 1.2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial average temperature. The temperature is rising by around 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. We have reason to believe that even at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we may reach a tipping point or a threshold that will propel us into a even more dangerous accelerated warming because of release of greenhouse gas from the permafrost, a change of ocean circulation. We may experience a catastrophic collapse of the Antarctic West ice sheet, and so forth, leading to several meters sea level rise. We're on the brink of climate disaster. This is no secret. We have known about it for a long time. We have not acted upon it. The second is a collapse of biodiversity. Species abundance, whole classes of species are collapsing because human beings have appropriated half or more of the non-desert, non-ice land area for human food production, pasture land and cropland, or for managed forests. We're destroying habitats of other species. Livestock and human biomass is about 95% of all mammal biomass on the planet now. In other words, our livestock have pushed out other land mammals out of their habitat. We make room for our cattle, and we destroy the rest of nature. The third dimension of environmental collapse, of course, is mega pollution. We know that the plastics and the microplastics are in every part of the food chain, terrestrial and ocean. We know that air pollution is a mass killer of millions. We suspect that the heavy burden of COVID-19 in northern Italy related also to the heavy air pollution in the north. because we need an explanation why there have been such geographically different outcomes in Italy from COVID-19. But one theory is that the air pollution has been an aggravating factor. And of course, the fourth dimension of environmental collapse is the increasing frequency of zoonotic diseases. COVID-19 is only the latest. We have had SARS in 2003, H1N1 recombinant influenza, Nipah virus, Middle East respiratory syndrome, Ebola outbreaks, all of them reflecting the transfer of pathogens from animal reservoirs to humans when humanity disturbed the natural environment. For example, disturbed the fruit bat population or the horseshoe bat population, came into contact with bats that are carrying Ebola or SARS or SARS-CoV-2. And so these increasingly frequent zoonotic events are also a reflection of this real dystopian threat. And then I would add finally, geopolitics on the brink. In a way, it is our existential reality since 1945, really since 1949, since the Soviet Union also exploded an atomic bomb, that we have been on the brink, minutes to midnight, as the atomic scientists say. But we also, despite the nuclear threat, we continue to engage in big power rivalries of exactly the kind that gave rise to World War I, for example. But the difference is that this time it's with nuclear weapons. We almost destroyed the world in October 1962. And now the absolutely reckless and foolish Trump administration has tried to build up a Cold War against China. My country's politicians have been idiots. They are completely without historical awareness or sense of responsibility, precaution, or what the Greeks called phronesis, practical wisdom. So they are crusaders or evangelical preachers of a US-led world, which is extraordinarily dangerous. These facts, extreme poverty, rising inequality, environmental collapse, geopolitical tensions, are the direction that we're on. This dystopian threat, some people would say, well, Professor Sachs, so what else is new? How could it be any other way? This is rather shocking because we are a rich world with an inheritance of the most beneficent, potentially, and powerful technologies to overcome extreme deprivation or to solve environmental crises. And yet we don't do so. And what I would say about economics, however, is that not that it has neglected these topics, but these have hardly been the center of economics attention. Somehow mainstream economics, in my country at least, has been about whether the US economy will grow by 2% or 2.4%, how to handle the business cycle and so forth, not about these great existential questions of the direction of the world as if these are somehow somebody else's concern. I'm not sure whose concern they should be, if not ours as economists who are charged with understanding the dynamics of the material world and how the material world is affected by human activity and the kinds of choices that we should be making about human activity. Now, all of these points that I've made are before our eyes every day. the mass displacement of hundreds of millions of people. In the United States, the stunning fact that a recent Nobel laureate, Angus Deaton, has rightly and wonderfully emphasized, that our inequality, for example, is so great and rising in the United States that we have two trajectories of deaths or of mortality. For college-educated people, men and women, the mortality trajectory are the gray flat lines at the bottom. In other words, the age-adjusted mortality rate is basically unchanging over the last 20 years, whereas the upward sloping red lines for high school or less educational attainment signify rising death rates, age-specific rising death rates for high school educated men and women. It's two different societies, those with the bachelor's degree and those with the high school degree or less. Those with the bachelor degree or more see rising incomes, work from home, are working online, are largely escaping the pandemic except for the health workforce. Those with a high school degree or less are working in factories or in shops or in transport or in delivery, and they are becoming infected. But even before that, there were rising suicide rates, rising alcoholism, rising drug dependence. Two societies, two different outcomes within the same country. And of course, two different politics as a result of this. We know that global warming, as I said, is out of control. This graph, which I won't elaborate at length, explains that we should be on the lower trajectory of the gray curve at the bottom in order to keep emissions falling in order to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius upper limit of warming. But instead, we are on the continuing upward sloping curves of rising emissions. This is up to COVID-19, but it will remain true in the post-COVID period unless we choose to turn the emissions curve downward. So this graph, to be elaborated, is from UNEP, the UN Environment Program, explaining that while we need to be suppressing the greenhouse gas emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, in fact, continue to rise. We also have a collapse of species abundance. This is a well-known curve produced by the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, called the Global Living Planet Index. It is a measure of species abundance across more than 4,000 species. And the minus 68% shown from 1970 to 2018 signifies a 68% decline on average of species across a very wide range of species. We're basically destroying the habitats of other species. And this abundance is falling for several reasons. One, in the fisheries, we're overfishing the fisheries. On land, we're either claiming the habitat of other species by deforesting and extending pasture lands and croplands, or we're destroying the habitability of land by human-induced climate change, or we are destroying the viability of other species through human-made pollution or the introduction of invasive species. That is, non-native species that take over like weeds a new ecological setting. But the gist of it is a massive collapse of species abundance. This fact is hardly known in the public discourse, and it is hardly known in economics, actually. It's an esoteric topic, not a central concern, as we drive the other 10 million species to the brink of survival. This complicated picture is from an important paper about the world's food system. It shows the very heavy burden that our current agricultural system imposes on the environment on multiple dimensions: greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, nitrogen flux, and phosphorus flux. In other words, the flow of nitrogen and phosphorus in the environment, in the water and in the air, and in the soils. And what it is showing, again, it needs to be written down and studied rather than talked about in 1 minute. It shows that the way we produce food for the 7.8 billion people on the planet is having a massive detrimental effect on the environment. But even worse, we're on a trajectory to 2050 where it could all get dramatically worse. Roughly somewhere between 25% and 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions today come from agriculture and land use transformation. Roughly a third of the greenhouse emissions. But all of those problems are getting worse. There's not one with a positive trajectory right now. So this says we can't even feed ourselves properly in a sustainable manner. And of course, we have COVID-19. If I needed to add to the litany of woes that our world faces. Finally, let me say there is lurking behind this a question that can be called the Malthusian specter, because the most pessimistic economist in the classic age was Thomas Robert Malthus, the parson in England in the late 18th century, who wrote in 1798 The Principles of Population, where he claimed we can never rise above subsistence, because if we do, the population will increase sufficiently to drive us back to subsistence. And of course, since he wrote that, classical economists and neoclassical economists, especially neoclassical economists since the second half of the 19th century, have been making fun of Malthus, saying, wrong, too pessimistic. After all, we've gotten rich. We avoided the Malthusian specter. But I would say not so fast, because when Malthus wrote in 1798, the population on the planet was 900 million people. Today it is 7.8 billion people, roughly 9 times as high. Soon it will be 10 times as high as when Malthus wrote. We have not proven that 10 billion people can live sustainably on the planet. We have proved that we can raise living standards temporarily, but if those dystopian trends that I just indicated are continuing, the viability of the planet for all but the elite is absolutely called into question. And so, as you can see in this projection using the UN's medium fertility variant, we are in 2020 at 7.8 billion, but the UN in its medium fertility assessment projects a population of 11.2 billion people, another 3.4 billion people added to the planet during the 21st century. Can we manage all of those environmental and social threats with the population still rising by another 3.4 billion people? So these big challenges, of course, are part of our human discourse, though not sufficiently part of our economics agenda, though they're becoming more central. But there are at least 3 temptations that have arisen that I would say are all dangerous. One is an apocalyptic tradition, which is unfortunately with a significant base in the United States, a belief that we are at the end times. And we have 20% of our population who are fundamentalist Christians who hear from their ministers sermons about the end times as being exemplified by all of these crises, that this is the prophecy of the book of Revelations, that we are about to face Armageddon. Some even look forward to this. It's terrifying. I would not recommend having a Secretary of State or a foreign minister who believes in Armageddon. Believe me, it's not a good thing. A second temptation is an anti-technology response, secular, that says, well, look what technology has gotten us into. We have to go back to simplicity. Technology is wrecking us. We have to go back to a simple life so that we don't destroy the earth. The problem with that is that there is no chance in the world of feeding and clothing and housing and meeting the basic needs, much less the aspirations of 7.8 billion people in a simple world. Maybe of 50 million people, maybe of 100 million people, but not 7.8 billion people or 9 billion people at mid-century. That kind of world's a complicated world. Every day, 7.8 billion people expect a decent, nutritious food supply, safe drinking water, sanitation, income sufficient to support themselves and their families, shelter, clothing, physical safety. And that is a complicated world, not a simple world. The third anti-technology temptation is the degrowth movement. Well, this is understandable in a way. If growth is destroying the planet, we should degrowth. But I find it much too vague and therefore unhelpful. If it means a sharp cut in living standards, even a sharp cut of living standards just of those in high income countries today, I think it's a misunderstanding. If it means stopping the blind use of the gross domestic product as our benchmark, it's completely correct. But if we're talking about real progress, I'm going to argue we can continue to have real progress in our material lives, in our conditions of living, in our health and longevity, in our ability to achieve well-being. And we should pursue that, but it requires not degrowth in a simple sense of a sharp cut in living standards, but a change in direction of how we produce and how we live. That is the main point that I want to make. So I believe that in addition to this dystopian threat, there is a sustainable development possibility, which is equally realistic and equally compatible with the finite planet, with the functioning of ecosystems, with the survival of biodiversity, and that is a far more desirable direction from the point of view of human well-being. In other words, it's the ethical choice. What is the sustainable development possibility? First, it is that poverty would be ended. By poverty, I mean deprivation of basic economic needs. By basic economic needs, I mean those that are enumerated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or in the economic, social, and cultural covenants of the 1960s. So those are adequate food, right to shelter, right to health care, right to education, right to social protection for everybody. And that is what I mean by ending poverty, that all of those basic needs, adequate basic income, health, education, nutrition, healthcare, shelter, safety can be achieved for everybody on the planet. Second, and relatedly, inequality can be reduced in that if everybody achieves these basic economic rights, health, education, social protection, nutrition, leisure time, environmental security, that would mark a tremendous reduction of inequality as well. It would, I believe, protect economic human dignity for everybody. Third is environmentally sustainable economic activity. That means that warming, which is on a path to reach 3 degrees Celsius, would peak before the end of the century at below 1.5 degrees Celsius. It means that we would protect and restore species abundance. It means a circular economy that slashes dramatically plastics pollution, toxic air pollution, and so on. For example, by shifting from fossil fuels, which are so polluting, to wind and solar power, which can be produced with very low levels of pollution. And fourth would be precaution against the kind of zoonotic outbreaks that we've devastatingly experienced this year. The fourth dimension of sustainable development would be global peace. It would be a multilateral world system operating under the UN Charter. It would take seriously the preeminent objective of nuclear disarmament, because as long as there are nuclear weapons, much less thousands of nuclear weapons, we are at the knife edge. We are under the sword of Damocles, because we have human beings and sometimes, in my country, idiots in charge. And they should not be in charge, but we have not figured out politically how to keep the demagogues and the mentally unstable and the psychopaths out of power. So they should not have any access whatsoever to nuclear weapons. And we should have systems for maintaining peace. Now, I want to argue this is not utopia, although it sounds a bit utopian. All of this is actually within practical reach, in the sense that the resource requirements, what we talk about as economists, the flow of finance, the physical resource availability, the time and attention required to meet these goals is well within our social possibilities. This would not require 5 planets or overcoming the second law of thermodynamics or any such thing. These are goals that can be achieved practically on our finite physical Earth and for a population of 8 or 9 billion people. I'm going to suggest in a moment, if we're smart, we won't reach 11 billion people because we will help to bring about, as part of sustainable development, a voluntary, rapid reduction of fertility rates that will mean a lower population in the future. So I'm going to argue today and tomorrow that that sustainable development possibility is practical, and that we need a different kind of economics and policy making, what Professor Caffè talks about as economic policy as an autonomous discipline. We need a kind of economic policy to direct us to the sustainable development goal rather than to the dystopian path that we are on right now. One part of that is a midway station of the sustainable development goals, which are aimed for the year 2030. We're way behind, but it's a good list of 17 goals. that address our attention to crucial areas like universal access to education, to healthcare, gender equality, climate action, circular economy, and so forth. So what is the core strategy for achieving sustainable development? From a material point of view or an investment point of view, I point to 6 main kinds of investments that need to be made. One is educating all children. We've done that in the high-income countries to an extent, although this year has been a crisis. But this is not the case for much of the world, where hundreds of millions of kids, even before COVID, were not getting an education. That is a shame on humanity, because often these are children in conflict zones or in impoverished countries that cannot afford to put the kids into classrooms, but we haven't seen fit to use our resources to help meet the needs of those children who are otherwise not getting an education. A second investment is in health services for all. And health means 2 things. One, health care in the form of medicine, so hospitals and clinics and doctors. And it also means public health in the sense of what we need more than ever with COVID-19, and that is surveillance system, testing and tracing, and other public health measures for population health. The third transformation we need is the mass deployment of renewable energy and circular economy, meaning different management of waste processes in industry, different materials use, different ways of recycling materials. So both the transformation to renewable energy and to the circular economy are practical technology investments. It means investing in solar and wind fields rather than in coal-fired power plants. It means driving electric vehicles that are powered by wind and solar rather than internal combustion engine vehicles. The fourth investment is a shift to healthier diets, basically less beef, more fish, vegetables, legumes, fruits, nuts, and to sustainable farming practices, agroecological practices. The fifth transformation is to digital, electric, and service-based cities. So what I mean by this is what is sometimes called smart cities, but cities that function in a much cleaner way. All vehicles electric, all buildings heated by electricity rather than by burning coal or wood or heating oil, using digital technologies for e-governance, using e-commerce to a much greater extent because it is an efficient way to transfer resources from a factory to a flat often than it is through traditional retailing. So restructuring our cities for a digital, electric, service-based age is part of the investments that we need. And the sixth area of investment is digital inclusion, because in my view, the digital world, meaning all of the technologies for computation, for data transfer, for artificial intelligence systems, robotics, and so forth, offer an opportunity for tremendous savings on resource use and tremendous improvement in quality of services, e-health, telemedicine, e-governance, and so forth. But again, not something that the market will sort out by itself. The market will lead to monopolies like Amazon or Google. It will not lead to digital inclusion for all. And so all of this is to say that 6 major kinds of investments, in my opinion, are the big difference of the dystopian future and the sustainable development future. All of this, to achieve these investments, however, requires two more things. One is a change of governance structures, so how we actually design public policies and implement them, because this is a 30-year time horizon for short-term governance. And second, how we mobilize finance, because if the finance is limited to market-based finance, it will not suffice, as we know. So I call these the 6 transformations to achieve sustainable development. And this graph just reiterates those 6 points: education, health, clean energy and industry, sustainable land use, smart cities, and digital technologies. And this graph, I will elaborate in writing, details some of the subcomponents of those investments. Now, we're not so far from this vision. And indeed, Europe took a major step forward this year with what I regard as a substantively very rich and a very well done approach of the European Commission, then adopted by the European Council, the European Green Deal. It is a rational approach to sustainable development. Indeed, the motto is transforming the EU's economy for a sustainable future. And it's really a good start because it has most or all of the components that I just mentioned. It has preserving biodiversity, sustainable land use, circular economy, clean and affordable energy. In other words, it has the main pillars needed. And it's got in blue at the bottom, you can see in this image by the European Commission, financing the transition and leaving no one behind. In other words, it recognizes that this is an investment problem. So it's a financing challenge, and it is an ethical challenge in that we're aiming for an inclusive approach to these issues. It gives me even more confidence that the European Green Deal is spurring similar initiatives in other parts of the world. Korea recently adopted a Korean New Deal that is based on 3 pillars: a digital New Deal, and of course, Korea is very good at the digital economy, one of the world leaders, a Green New Deal based on low carbon energy, and a stronger safety net for social inclusion. And I'm impressed with what Korea is undertaking to institutionalize this process and to get it funded. Indeed, more and more countries are signing up to a mid-century goal of decarbonization. This includes the European 27, it includes Britain, it includes Ireland, it includes Canada, Chile, South Africa, New Zealand, and it will include the United States, wonderfully, on January 20th, 2021, when we get rid of our anti-scientific president now and welcome a new, sensible, rational president, Joe Biden, who will declare on January 20th that one of the goals of the United States is to decarbonize the US economy by mid-century. So this idea of looking to mid-century, putting a marker on the horizon, and then aiming for long-term transformation is actually becoming part of our broad policy, not our national government politics yet, but our broad conceptualization of politics. This is an advance of policymaking. We have the chance to do the same thing with land use. There will be an important conference next May on biological diversity hosted in Kunming, China. And we need similar pathways to 2050, or I should say similar goals for mid-century that we can then design pathways and policies to achieve. There will also be a food systems summit at the United Nations in September 2021 to ensure safe and nutritious food for all, sustainable consumption, nature positive production practices, equitable rural livelihoods, and resiliency. In other words, 5 goals for sustainable agriculture that are also part of building this long-term sustainable development future. Now, one reason we can do this is that I think we can also realistically put to rest the Malthusian specter. Remember what Malthus said. He said that whenever humanity became a bit richer, more children survive. People, therefore, families have more surviving children. The population increases, and the population rises to a point where the carrying capacity of the planet pushes down living standards once again to subsistence. So Malthus said, you can't get out of poverty because population will always increase after innovations up to the point of depressing living standards once again to subsistence. And this, as I indicated, is still to be proved wrong. But that's our job, is to prove it wrong. The main reason that it can be proved wrong is something that Malthus didn't really suspect and didn't know about. And that is that when households reached a certain level of higher income, they chose voluntarily to have fewer children. Malthus assumed the richer, the more children surviving, the faster the population. But in fact, we now understand 2 centuries later, there is a demographic transition, which is a voluntary reduction of fertility as households decide, given the value of their time, to have fewer children and to invest more in the upbringing of the children, a kind of responsible parenthood that means that the children are equipped with the health, the nutrition, and the skills that they will need for an advanced economy. And this demographic transition is extremely important for our story. The good news is the following. What you see here is the United Nations current estimate for 2020 and the forecast for the 21st century of the fertility rates by region. And what you can see is that for all regions of the world but one, fertility rates are about 2 children per woman. That is what's called the replacement rate. If each woman has 2 children on average and 1 is a daughter, each woman is replacing herself with another mother in the following generation. And so if the fertility rate is 2, we know we get to a stable population. In fact, the fertility rate hovers around 2 for most of the world. It's slightly above 2 now in some regions, slightly above 2 in Asia, slightly below 2 in Latin America, much more below 2 in Europe and North America. But there's one region where the fertility rate remains very, very high, and that is Africa, where still the fertility is more than 4 children per woman on average, meaning that each mother on average has 2 daughters. And that means the population tendency to double, not to stabilize. And that's what's happening in Africa right now. Why is there one region in the world with high fertility? It is a kind of poverty trap, because what has happened is with such poverty in Africa, girls are not able to stay in school, and they are dropping out of school or forced out of school after 6 years or 8 years. marrying young without skills in the workforce other than the backbreaking toil in agriculture or in trade, because women work so hard in Africa, but without a university education or even a completed high school degree. And those women are having many children, marrying young and having many children. And there's a kind of trap of poverty because the countries do not have the national budgets to ensure universal access to education. And so education levels remain very low, early marriage remains very high, fertility remains very high, the population growth is very rapid, and the poverty is accentuated. And what one can see, this is a complicated map, but it is a map of what's called gender inequality. And it is in tropical Africa where the gender inequality is highest, signifying basically that the girls are not getting adequate schooling. That's what the red for tropical Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East are showing. That's where the fertility rates remain very high. So to overcome those high fertility rates, the key is rather simple, which is enable girls to remain in school, stay educated, gain the skills, join the labor market, marry later, engage in responsible parenthood. And that will lead to a voluntary reduction of fertility rates that is quite rapid and therefore changes the dynamics of the population. Now, under the UN's medium fertility forecast, fertility rates remain very high in Africa. And the result is that the African population is projected to grow from 1.4 billion today to 4.2 billion in 2100. If you can imagine it, almost 3 billion population increase. That's extraordinary. Almost a 4-time increase of population projected by the UN Population Division. The rest of the world, which is shown in the blue line here, is projected to have no net population increase over the 21st century, basically to end the 21st century at the same level of population as in 2020. And so all of the population increase expected in the 21st century is in Africa, but that is a consequence of poverty, but also likely to be a cause of poverty in the future. Now, what the UN shows is that if there were a reduction of the fertility rate to replacement level, there would still be some momentum of population growth because Africa's population is very young. So there are more children than there are parents right now. So population will continue to grow even if fertility rates come down. But the difference of having a replacement rate fertility and a medium fertility scenario is 2 billion people by the end of the century. Now, I will assert in brief, and we can discuss it in the discussion period, that Africa could not achieve a breakthrough out of poverty and environmental sustainability with more than 4 billion people on the continent. And so a voluntary reduction of fertility rates, in my view, brought about overwhelmingly through education for all, through the upper secondary level as a basis, is desirable for Africa and for the world, and is the way to overcome the so-called Malthusian specter. If there is such a rapid transformation to low fertility, then the world population would actually peak or would reach about 9 billion at the end of the 21st century, up 1 billion. Whereas instead, if there is not that fertility transformation, the population would reach 11 billion, and that would be very difficult as a pressure against achieving sustainable development and the escape from poverty, both within Africa and at a global scale. And I will skip those to come to a conclusion for today. We have two futures. Both are realistic. The dystopian future is a future that's based on extrapolation. It's perfectly plausible that we'll have an awful future, awful for our children, awful for our grandchildren, a planet that has been wrecked environmentally, an inequality of income that is so high that a few people have all the wealth and the rest are either unemployed and desperate or work for those few people. And we are heading for such a world right now. We have 4 Americans, just 4 people. Jeffrey Bezos of Amazon, Elon Musk of Tesla, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and Bill Gates of Microsoft, 4 people who have a combined wealth of about $550 billion. So this is how our markets work right now. They send the wealth and income to the top with so much desperation at the bottom that is a realistic scenario. But as I've tried to indicate briefly, the other scenario is an investment pathway in education, health, clean energy, clean industry, sustainable land use practices, sustainable smart cities, and a digital society that fits within the resource boundaries, that could stabilize the population growth, that could enable us to overcome the Malthusian specter, and that could end the great devastations of the environment that we have seen. All of this I'll call the great transformation. Of course, I'm stealing from Karl Polanyi, who talked about the great transformation to the laissez-faire economy of the 19th century. We need a great transformation to sustainable development of the 21st century. In tomorrow's lecture, I want to talk about the politics, the policy framework, and the ethical framework to achieve the great transformation to sustainable development. And I'll stop here for now. Thank you very much.